The moon was a sliver, a cruel shard of bone-white light that did little to pierce the oppressive dark of the high plains. It offered no comfort, only just enough visibility to mock the girl's clumsy flight, illuminating the grasping thorns of mesquite that tore at her dress and the sharp edges of rocks that bruised her bare feet. Every shadow was a monster, every rustle of the dry grass a pursuer. Her lungs burned with a fire that had long since consumed all her strength, each breath a ragged tear in the fabric of the vast, uncaring silence. Her name, or what she thought was her name, was a forgotten whisper, lost somewhere back in the shouting and the chaos. All that remained was the primal, desperate need to keep moving. For hours, she had run. The world had become a smear of pain and fear. The fine cotton of her dress, once a pale blue dotted with tiny flowers, was now a tattered ruin of gray and brown, stained with dirt and thin streaks of her own blood. A long scratch, fiery and deep, ran from her temple down her cheek, weeping a slow, steady trail. She had lost a shoe miles back, and the soul of its mate had given way an hour ago, leaving the tender skin of her feet to the mercy of the unforgiving ground. She stumbled, her ankle twisting with a sharp crack of protest, and fell to her knees in the dust. A sob, dry and raw, escaped her lips. This was it. She could go no farther. The sounds she'd been fleeing, the thunder of hooves, the guttural calls of men were no longer audible, but she could feel them in her bones, a phantom vibration that promised a fate worse than a clean death in the wilderness. She pressed her forehead to the cool earth and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Prayed for an end. It was then that she saw it. Not a star, for it was too low, too warm. A light, a single steady pinprick of gold glowing in the infinite blackness. Hope, a thing she thought had been bled out of her on the trail, surged with a painful, shocking intensity. It was a house, a cabin, a chance. The distance was impossible, yet she covered it. She crawled at first, her hands raw and bleeding, then staggered to her feet, leaning on a phantom strength born of pure desperation. The light grew, resolving itself into the square of a window, a beacon in the wilderness. It seemed to sit at the edge of the world, a solitary outpost against the encroaching night. As she drew closer, she could make out the dark, solid shape of a log cabin, smoke curling from its stone chimney in a thin, ghostly ribbon. There was no fence, no sign of life other than the lamp and the smoke. No dog barked a warning. The silence here was different, not the menacing quiet of the open plains, but a deep, settled stillness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. She reached the door, a heavy thing of thick, rough-hewn planks. Her hand, trembling and caked with dirt, rose to knock. The effort was immense. Her knuckles rapped against the wood, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet. Once, twice. She waited, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She could hear nothing from within. Perhaps it was empty. Perhaps the lamp was left burning by mistake. The thought sent a fresh wave of despair washing over her. She raised her hand to knock again, with more force. But before her knuckles could connect, a sound came from within the scraping of a chair, the soft fall of heavy boots on a wood floor. A bolt, thick and metallic, was drawn back with a resonant thud. The door swung inward without a creak. The man who stood there filled the frame. He was tall, broader at the shoulders than any man she had ever seen up close. The lamplight behind him cast him in silhouette, a formidable shadow with no discernible features. He did not speak. He did not move, save for the slow, deliberate way he held the door open. The warm air from inside washed over her, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, the clean, masculine scent of pine soap and leather. It was the smell of safety, a scent so foreign it almost made her weep. She tried to speak, but her throat was a desert. She swallowed, the motion agonizing. Her eyes, adjusted to the gloom, began to make out details. His hair was dark and shaggy, falling over the collar of a plain homespun shirt. His hands, one resting on the edge of the door, were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but it was his face, slowly coming into focus, that held her. It was a landscape of its own, carved from granite and weathered by sun and wind. A strong jaw was covered in a day's worth of dark stubble, and his eyes, deep set beneath a straight brow, were unreadable pools of shadow. They looked at her not with surprise, or pity, or even curiosity, but with a flat, unnerving stillness. He was simply looking, assessing. She found her voice, a sound so small and fragile it was barely more than an exhalation of air. "Please," she breathed, the word a painful rasp. "Just for one night." The silence that followed stretched into an eternity. He did not move a muscle. His gaze traveled over her, a slow, methodical inventory. It took in the tangled, matted hair, the terrified eyes, the bleeding scratch on her cheek. It lingered on the torn bodice of her dress. But there was nothing of a lecher's interest in it. It was the look of a man noting a detail, a piece of a puzzle he wasn't asking to be solved. His eyes dropped to her bruised and broken feet, then rose again to meet hers. Still, he said nothing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, that this silent, stony man was a danger as great as the one she had fled. But her body would not obey. She had nothing left. This was the end of the line. If he turned her away, she would lie down on his doorstep and wait for the morning sun or the coyotes, whichever came first. He tilted his head, a gesture so slight it was barely perceptible. It was the only sign that he had heard, that he was considering her plea. He was not weighing mercy against caution. It felt more fundamental, like a predator deciding if the strange, wounded creature before it was a threat, a meal, or simply an irrelevance. She braced for the inevitable shutting of the door in her face. Instead, he stepped back, a slow, deliberate movement that was an invitation and nothing more. He made no gesture for her to enter, offered no word of welcome. He simply created a space for her to occupy, leaving the choice entirely to her. She hesitated for a single, thumping heartbeat, then stumbled forward, crossing the threshold from the cold, hostile night into the stark warmth of the cabin. She was immediately overwhelmed by the sense of a contained, masculine world. A fire crackled low in a great stone hearth, its embers glowing a deep, hypnotic orange. A single bed, covered with a thick buffalo hide, was built into one corner. A sturdy table made of a single slab of pine stood in the center of the room. One chair beside it, on a rack above the fireplace. A long rifle rested, its oiled barrel gleaming in the firelight. The place was Spartan, impeccably clean, and utterly devoid of any soft or feminine touch. It was the den of a man who lived alone and was accustomed to it. The door swung shut behind her, plunging the room into the dim, flickering intimacy of the fire and the single lamp on the table. The sound of the heavy bolts sliding back into place was a deafening crack in the quiet. It echoed in the small space, a sound of finality. She stood frozen just inside the door, her back to him, every muscle tensed. The lock had shut the night out, but it had also shut her in. With him, she heard him move behind her, the soft scuff of his boots on the floorboards. She flinched, expecting a hand on her shoulder, a voice in her ear. But he did not touch her. He walked past her to the hearth and nudged the logs with a cast-iron poker, sending a shower of bright sparks up the chimney. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion, the way a man who is intimately familiar with his surroundings does. He turned and looked at her again, his expression as unreadable as before. He picked up a dipper from a wooden bucket near the fire and filled it with water. He held it out to her. It was not an offering so much as a statement of fact. "You are thirsty. Drink." Her hands shook so violently she could barely take it from him. Their fingers brushed, his skin rough and warm. The jolt of contact was like lightning. She drank, the water cool and sweet, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It sluiced the dust from her throat and seemed to bring a small piece of her soul back to her body. She drank until the dipper was empty, then looked at him over its rim, not knowing what to do next. He took it from her, his movements patient, and set it down. He gestured with his chin toward the fire. "Sit," he said. His voice, it was the first time he had spoken. It was as she expected, low, rough, like stones grinding together. A voice that was not used often. She obeyed without thinking, sinking down onto the braided rag rug before the hearth. The warmth seeped into her chilled bones, a blessed relief. She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, trying to make herself as small as possible. She felt like a stray dog, taken in from a storm, not knowing if the hand that fed it would be the same one that would later strike it. He did not sit with her. He returned to the table and took his seat, the chair groaning in protest under his weight. He did not eat or read, or busy himself with some task. He simply sat, watching the fire, though she felt his awareness of her as a physical presence in the room. He was a mountain, a creature of stillness and silence, and she was a trembling leaf in his shadow. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. She risked a glance at him. In the flickering light, she could see his face more clearly. He was older than she first thought, perhaps 30, maybe more. There were lines etched at the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting into the sun. A faint, white scar cut through one of his dark eyebrows. It was a hard face, a face that had seen things, but there was no cruelty in it. There was just nothing. A profound and unnerving emptiness, a complete absence of readable emotion. He seemed a man who had locked all his feelings away. So long ago he'd forgotten where he put the key. Finally, he rose again. He walked to a small chest in the corner and took out a clean, worn blanket made of thick wool. He laid it on the floor on the other side of the hearth, a good 10 feet from where he slept. Then he took a small, sharp knife and a piece of wood from the kindling box and returned to his chair at the table. He began to whittle, long, thin shavings falling to the floor, his hands moving with an expert, mesmerizing grace. He had given her a place to sleep, and now he was giving her the privacy of his inattention. She understood. No more words would be exchanged tonight. No questions would be asked. She was a piece of flotsam washed up on his shore, and he had decided, for reasons of his own, to let her rest on the sand until the tide turned. She lay down on the blanket, pulling its rough comfort up to her chin. It smelled of him, that same clean, smoky scent. She was exhausted beyond measure, but sleep felt like a betrayal, a lowering of her guard. She lay on her side, facing the fire, and watched him. He never looked up from his work, his face a mask of concentration in the lamplight. The knife rose and fell. The small pile of wood shavings grew, and the tall, silent stranger kept his vigil. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was warm. She was inside, and a locked door stood between her and the horrors of the night. It was not safety, not yet, but it was a beginning. Her eyelids grew heavy, and against her will, she drifted into the deep, dark well of sleep. Sleep did not come easily. It was a shallow, treacherous country, bordered by the jagged cliffs of memory and the dark woods of fear. She would drift for a moment into a thick, dreamless black, only to be violently thrown back to the surface by the phantom sound of a snapping twig or a man's low laugh. Her body, though utterly spent, remained coiled and tense, a wire humming with the electricity of her flight. The fire in the hearth had settled into a bed of deep, pulsating embers, casting a soft, blood-red glow on the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling. The cabin was warm, quieter than any place she had ever known. Yet the silence was a fragile skin stretched taut over a drum of impending violence. She lay on the wool blanket, her cheek pressed against its coarse weave. The scent of pine soap and wood smoke, the scent of the silent man across the room, was a strange sort of anchor. It was the only thing that felt real in the disorienting space between exhaustion and terror. She turned her head just enough to see him. He had not moved from his chair at the table. The small knife in his hand was still, the piece of wood resting in his palm, half formed into the shape of a bird. His head was bowed slightly, and, for a moment, she thought he might be asleep, a statue carved from shadow and stillness. But then his thumb moved, a slow, deliberate stroke along the grain of the wood, and she knew he was as awake as she was. He was watching, waiting, but for what? The question was a prayer she was too afraid to ask. This man had taken her in without a word of judgment or inquiry. He had offered water, warmth, and the unspoken promise of his formidable presence as a shield. But she was trouble. She carried it with her like a sickness, and she had brought it into his clean, quiet world. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a chore. He was a stranger, and she had made him a target. It was the man who heard it first. She saw the change in him before she heard the sound itself. The slow, rhythmic motion of his thumb ceased. His hand, the one holding the half-carved bird, closed into a fist, the knuckles turning white. His head lifted, his gaze fixed not on her, or the fire, or anything inside the cabin, but on something beyond the walls, something in the vast, listening dark. He was absolutely motionless, like a stag that had caught the scent of a wolf on the wind. His stillness was more frightening than any sudden movement could have been. The fragile peace of the cabin shattered. She held her breath, straining her ears, trying to hear what he heard. At first, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind around the eaves and the gentle sigh of the cooling embers. Then, it came. A low, rhythmic vibration. Felt more than heard. A tremor in the soles of her feet, in the very air she breathed. It grew steadily, resolving itself into a sound her body knew with sickening familiarity, the sound of shod hooves on hard-packed earth. It was not one horse, but several, moving at a steady, unhurried pace, a searching pace. A whimper escaped her lips, a tiny, involuntary sound. The man's head turned, and his eyes found hers in the dim light. The emptiness was gone from them. In its place was something cold, hard, and ancient. It was the look of a man who was no stranger to violence, a look that acknowledged the coming storm without a flicker of fear or surprise. It simply was, and it had to be met. He rose from his chair, his movements fluid and silent, a panther unfolding from rest. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood before the single window, which was covered by a thin screen of greased hide. He did not pull it aside. Instead, he pressed his face close to the edge of the wooden frame, peering through a tiny crack between the hide and the logs. He stood there for a long time, a minute that stretched and warped until it felt like an hour. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer. They were no longer moving. They had stopped somewhere just beyond the small clearing that surrounded the cabin. When the man finally stepped back from the window, his face was set like stone. He moved to the table where the oil lamp still burned, its flame a single, steady tongue of gold. He didn't blow it out. He lifted the glass chimney, and with a pinch of his calloused thumb and forefinger, snuffed the wick. The flame vanished, plunging the room into a profound darkness, broken only by the faint, hellish glow of the embers. The sudden absence of light was a physical blow. It stole her breath, leaving her adrift in a sea of shadows. He was a ghost in the gloom, a darker shape moving against the dark. He returned to the window and tugged the hide covering, ensuring it was secure. Then he turned and walked to the fireplace. His hands reached up, and she heard the solid, definitive sound of heavy, oiled steel being lifted from wooden pegs. The rifle, it was nearly as tall as she was, a long, menacing shape against the firelight. He held it with an easy familiarity, breaking it open with a practiced motion to check the load. The quiet click of the mechanism was the loudest sound she had ever heard. He had not said a word. He had not asked her a single question. He did not need to. He knew what the sound of horses in the dead of night meant. He had seen the terror in her eyes, the story written in the scratches and bruises on her skin. He had taken her in, and in doing so, he had chosen his side. The sounds from outside became sharper, more distinct. The creak of saddle leather as a man dismounted, the dull thud of heavy boots hitting the ground, a low murmur of voices. The words indistinct, but the tone a low, ugly growl. They were here. They were all around the cabin. She pushed herself up, her limbs trembling uncontrollably. She could feel them, just on the other side of the log walls, their presence a suffocating pressure. They were so close, the men she had run from, the men whose faces haunted her waking moments and her dreams. They had found her. She scrambled to her feet, the wool blanket falling away from her. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She looked at the man, a silent specter with the long rifle held loosely in his hands. He was her only hope, and he was a complete stranger. She had to make him understand. "They're looking for me," she whispered, her voice cracking, raw with terror. It was a confession and a plea, an apology for the death she had brought to his door. He stood with his back to the fire, the red glow outlining his broad frame. He turned his head slightly, his profile carved out of the darkness. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't coldness or emptiness. It was a kind of grim resolve. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of absolute certainty. "Let them look," he said. The two words fell into the silence of the room. Not a comfort, not a reassurance, but a declaration. It was a line drawn in the earth. It was the sound of a door being bolted not against the night, but against the world. He was not telling her that everything would be all right. He was telling her that if they wanted her, they would have to come through him. Outside, a man's voice rose, harsh and impatient. "We know you're in there. Girl, we saw the light. You can't hide forever." Another voice, rougher, joined in. "And whoever's with you, send the girl out, and we'll be on our way. Make it easy on yourself." The man in the cabin did not answer. He moved to the side of the door. Placing his back against the solid logs, he raised the rifle, the long barrel pointing toward the ceiling, his thumb resting near the hammer. He was a part of the cabin now, as solid and unmoving as the foundation stones. He settled into wait. She stood frozen in the center of the room, trapped between the silent, armed man and the circle of predators outside. The smell of wood smoke was thick in the air, but now it was mingled with the sharp, metallic scent of fear. She could hear them walking, their boots crunching on the dry ground, circling the cabin like wolves. A shadow passed by the thin height of the window. A hand rattled the latch on the door. It was a heavy, probing sound, testing for weakness. But the door held, the bolt was strong, and inside, the stranger waited, his promise hanging in the dark. Silent air. Let them look. The night was far from over. It had only just begun. The silence inside the cabin was a living thing, a third presence in the room. It was thick and heavy, absorbing the frantic thumping of her heart and the whisper of the embers. Outside, the world was full of noise, the crunch of boots on gravel, the creak of leather, the low, guttural murmur of men who were accustomed to taking what they wanted. A hand tried the door latch again, a hard, impatient rattle that vibrated through the floorboards and up her spine. She squeezed her eyes shut, a useless gesture, as if not seeing would make her invisible. The man with the rifle did not move. He seemed less a man of flesh and blood and more a figure carved from the very logs of the cabin, a sentinel grown from the foundation. The firelight caught the hard line of his jaw, the grim set of his mouth. He was breathing. She knew, but the rise and fall of his chest was so slow, so measured, that he might as well have been made of stone. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his entire being. His senses extended out into the darkness, mapping the movements of the men outside. "Jedediah, you sure this is the place?" A voice whined from the night. young and nervous. I said she ran this way. A second voice answered, this one a low growl, full of gravel and authority. Jedediah. The name sent a fresh spike of ice through her veins. The light was on. She's in there. The only question is who she found to hide with. Ain't no horse, the younger one observed. No buggy. Place looks like it ain't been touched in a year. Man who lives like this ain't looking for company. Jedediah grunted. Means he's either a fool or he's got a reason. I'm guessing it ain't the first. There was a pause, a moment of heavy silence. Hello, the house, he bellowed, his voice booming against the wood. We don't want no trouble. We're U.S. Marshals looking for a runaway fugitive. You've got government property in there. The lie was so bald, so audacious, that it almost made her want to laugh, a hysterical sound that died in her throat. The man beside her didn't even blink. The claim, meant to intimidate a simple homesteader, had no effect on him. It was as if Jedediah had shouted his threat at a mountain. The mountain did not care. She watched him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. He held the rifle not with tension but with a kind of relaxed readiness, the stock resting near the floor, the long barrel angled up. It was an extension of his arm, a part of him. There was no wasted energy, no anxious shifting of his weight. It was this absolute stillness, this utter lack of reaction. That was his answer. A shout, a threat in return, would have been a conversation. Silence was a wall. It was a void that their threats and their bluster fell into, swallowed without an echo. It told them nothing, and in doing so, told them everything. I am not afraid of you. Your words mean nothing here. This ground is mine. He ain't answering, the young voice said, the nervousness turning into a whine. Maybe nobody's home. Somebody bolted the door, Jedediah snapped. And it's a damn heavy bolt. I felt it. This ain't right. Billy, you and Tom, circle round the back. See what you can see. She heard their footsteps retreat, crunching a wide circle around the cabin. Her gaze darted to the back of the small, one-room space. There were no other windows, no other doors. It was a fortress of logs, with only one way in. She looked back at her protector. He remained at his post, his attention fixed on the front. He knew his ground. He knew its strengths and its weaknesses. Minutes passed. The crackle of the fire was the only sound. Then, Billy's voice, from a distance. Nothing back here. Jed chinked up tight as a drum chimney stone all the way up. The footsteps returned to the front. The men gathered again, their frustration a palpable thing, a scent on the night air. This is a waste of time. A third voice grumbled. She ain't worth this. Let's just burn him out. And bring the whole county down on us, you fool. Jedediah's voice was a low, dangerous snarl. We get the girl. We get paid. We burn a man's house down. We get a rope. Use your head. Tom. He paused, then raised his voice again, trying a different tactic. Friend, listen to me. The girl you got in there, she's a thief. Stole a horse and a good bit of money from a fine, upstanding citizen. We just want to return the property. You help us, and there might be a reward in it for you. The man in the cabin remained silent. He didn't believe the lie, but more than that, it was clear he didn't care if it was a lie or the gospel truth. The reason she was here was irrelevant. The fact that she was here, and that he had bolted the door behind her, was the only thing that mattered. His honor, his code, whatever it was that drove a man to live in such profound isolation, was a simple, unshakable thing. He had given sanctuary, and he would not withdraw it. She could feel the tide turning outside. The hunter's confidence was eroding, replaced by a sullen, confused anger. They were men used to fear, used to their presence being enough to make people cower. The absolute lack of fear from within was an unknown quantity, a variable they couldn't account for. It was like kicking a hornet's nest and getting no buzz, no swarm, just a deep, unnerving quiet that suggested the hornet waiting inside was bigger and more deadly than any they had ever encountered. Jedediah must have sensed it too. He made one last, desperate push. "All right, have it your way," he shouted, his voice tight with fury. "We'll be back, you hear me? We'll be back when the sun is up. And we'll have more men you can't hide in there forever." There was a heavy thud against the door, the sound of a frustrated kick, then a scraping sound. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the man, her eyes wide with a question. He understood. His gaze flickered down to the bottom of the door, then back to her, a slight shake of his head. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was a message, a final act of intimidation. The scraping stopped. There was a moment of quiet. Then Jedediah spoke again, his voice lower, closer to the door, meant only for the occupants. "You think on it. One girl ain't worth dying for." Then came the sound she had been praying for, the crunch of boots walking away, the jingle of harness, the low nicker of a horse, the heavy grunt of men mounting up, the sound of hooves. At first a chaotic shuffle, then settling into a steady rhythm, heading back the way they had come, fading, fainter, and then gone. They were gone. The silence that descended was profound. It was a physical release, a weight lifting from the air. She hadn't realized she had been holding every muscle in her body rigid until they began to ache and tremble with the release of tension. A sob, thick and painful, rose in her chest, and she choked it back. She would not cry, not in front of him. He did not move for a long time. He stood by the door, listening to a silence only he could interpret. He was waiting for the echo, for the trick, for the one man left behind. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the slow fall of ash in the hearth. The deep, settled quiet of the high plains returned, a peace she thought she would never feel again. Finally, with a sigh so soft it was barely audible, he moved. He did not unbolt the door. He simply lowered the rifle, the tension flowing out of his shoulders. He walked to the fireplace and carefully, reverently, placed the long gun back on its pegs above the mantel. The action was final. The immediate danger was over. He turned to face her. In the dim glow of the embers, his face was a mask of shadows. Impossible to read, but his presence no longer felt menacing. It felt solid, protective. He was a rock in a storm, and the storm had passed. She found her voice, a thread of sound in the vast quiet. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. Flimsy things. They couldn't possibly contain the depth of her gratitude. He had saved her life. He, a man who didn't even know her name, had faced down armed men for her. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to pierce right through her. His expression did not soften. "Don't thank me," he said, his voice the same low, rough timbre as before. "Stay still." It wasn't a command born of anger or impatience. It was a caution, a reminder that the threat had not been eliminated, only postponed. Don't get comfortable. Don't let your guard down. He was telling her that his protection was a conditional thing, dependent on her sense and her stillness. He was a man who dealt in the practical, the tangible. Gratitude was a currency he had no use for. Survival was the only coin that mattered. He walked to the fire and used the poker to stir the embers, coaxing a few small, brave flames to life. He added a single, dry log, which caught quickly, pushing the deep shadows back a few feet. Then he returned to his chair at the table. He picked up the half-finished bird and his knife, and in a gesture of profound, unspoken finality, he turned his back to her and resumed his whittling. He had dismissed her. The event was over, and he was moving on. He expected her to do the same. She stood for a moment longer, her body still humming with the ghost of her fear. She looked at his broad back, the steady, rhythmic movement of his hands. He was offering her not comfort, not kindness, but something far more rare and valuable, the gift of his indifference. He was not going to pry. He was not going to question. He was going to let her be. Slowly, she sank back down onto the wool blanket. She lay on her side, facing the newly revived fire, its warmth a gentle hand on her cheek. She could feel the solid wall of the cabin at her back. She could hear the quiet scrape of his knife on wood. Outside, the wind whispered, but it was just the wind now, not a harbinger of danger. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay for hours washed over her in a great, crushing wave. It was heavier than anything she had ever felt, a physical force that pulled her down into the darkness. For the first time since she had clawed her way out of that terrible room miles and miles away, the knot of terror in her belly began to loosen. It did not disappear, but it softened, its sharp edges blurring. Here in this small, rough room, with a silent, watchful stranger, she was safe. It might only be for a few more hours. The men had promised to return with the dawn, but the dawn was a lifetime away. For now, there was only the warmth of the fire, the solidness of the walls, and the quiet presence of the man who had stood between her and the dark. Her eyelids fluttered shut. Sleep took her, not the shallow, haunted sleep of the pursued, but a deep, dreamless plunge into a quiet, peaceful black. And in that darkness, for the first time, there were no monsters. She awoke to the quiet invasion of dawn, not to a sound, but to a subtle shift in the quality of the darkness. The deep, absolute black of the cabin's interior was softening at the edges, turning to a charcoal gray. A thin, pale line of light appeared at the bottom of the door and around the edges of the hide-covered window, a silent announcement that the night was over. Her first conscious thought was of them. They're coming back. She sat up with a jolt, her heart instantly resuming its frantic, fearful rhythm. The wool blanket pooled around her waist. Her eyes darted around the small room. The fire was a mound of pale, feathery ash. The chair at the table was empty. He was gone. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. He had left her. He had slipped out in the pre-dawn gloom, abandoning her to her fate. She was alone, trapped. She scrambled to her knees, her eyes wide, staring at the bolted door, expecting it to burst open at any second. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound from outside, the gentle whish-thump of an axe splitting wood. He hadn't left. He was just outside, beginning his day as if the siege in the night had been nothing more than an unpleasant dream. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, that it left her weak. She sank back onto her heels, her forehead resting on the rough blanket, and took her first deep, shuddering breath of the new day. When she finally found the strength to stand, her body protested. Every muscle ached, and the cuts on her feet stung with a renewed fire. In the growing light, she could see the cabin more clearly. It was even more Spartan than she had realized. There were no pictures, no books, no decorations of any kind. Every object had a purpose: the bed for sleeping, the table for eating, the hearth for warmth, the rifle for protection. It was the home of a man who had stripped his life down to its barest essentials. And yet, it was impeccably clean. The floor was swept. The few pots and pans hanging by the hearth were scrubbed, and a neat stack of firewood stood ready. She felt a sudden, urgent need to be useful. She was a guest here, a refugee, but she could not be a burden. She looked at the cold hearth. Her father had taught her how to build a fire, a small bit of practical knowledge from a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. She found the kindling box, her movements still clumsy with sleep and soreness, and began to lay the foundation: a small pile of dried moss, a lattice of tiny twigs, then larger sticks. She had no matches, but she saw the flint and steel on the mantel. With trembling hands, she struck them together. A spark flew, then another. On the third try, a spark caught in the moss, smoldering for a moment before a tiny, orange flame bloomed. She blew on it gently, nurturing it, protecting it, until it was strong enough to lick at the larger twigs. The cabin door opened. He stood there, his arms full of freshly split logs, the cold morning air swirling in around him. He stopped on the threshold, his gaze falling on her kneeling before the hearth, on the small, growing fire. She froze, expecting a reprimand, an order to stop. She was a stranger, touching his things, meddling in his routine. He said nothing. His expression was as unreadable as ever in the gray morning light. He simply watched her for a moment, then walked past her and dropped the firewood into the wood box with a series of solid, reassuring thuds. He took a single log and placed it carefully on her fledgling fire. It was not a correction, but a contribution, an acceptance. A silent pact was made in that moment. He would not command her. She would not ask permission. She would simply see what needed doing, and she would do it. While he started a pot of coffee, its rich, bitter aroma slowly filling the room. She saw the water bucket was nearly empty. Without a word, she picked it up, intending to go to whatever well or stream served the cabin. The bucket was heavy, and her arms shook with the strain. Before she could reach the door, he was there, his large hand closing over hers on the handle. He did not pry her fingers away. He simply took the weight of the bucket from her, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I'll go," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. He took his rifle from the rack, a stark reminder that the morning's peace was a fragile thing, and stepped outside. She watched from the doorway as he walked across the clearing toward a line of cottonwood trees. The world outside was vast and empty, a rolling sea of pale brown grass under a sky so immense it was humbling. The cabin sat in the middle of nowhere, a tiny island of human existence in an ocean of wilderness. There was no road, no fence, no sign of any other soul for miles in any direction. And yet, the men had found her here. He returned with the full bucket, water sloshing over the rim. She took it from him at the door, their hands brushing again. This time, she did not flinch. She carried the water to its place by the hearth, her half of the task complete. He drank the coffee black and strong, standing by the fire. She found a tin cup and poured a little for herself, the warmth a welcome shock to her system. They ate a breakfast of cold biscuits and jerky, a meal of necessity, not comfort, and the silence between them was no longer tense or frightening. It was becoming a language of its own. Later, as he was cleaning his rifle at the table, his movements precise and economical, she noticed a long, L-shaped tear in the sleeve of his shirt, the one he had worn the night before. It was hanging from a peg near the door, on a small shelf, tucked behind a tin of coffee. She found a small wooden box. Inside was not a delicate sewing kit of the sort her mother had owned, but a purely functional collection of thick, waxed thread, a few heavy needles, and a lump of beeswax. She took the shirt down. The fabric was coarse homespun, worn soft with countless washings. She sat on the rug by the fire, the shirt across her lap, and began to mend the tear. Her stitches were small and neat, a skill learned during the long, quiet afternoons that felt a world away. She worked with intense concentration, focusing on the simple, repetitive motion of the needle, the pull of the thread, the way the torn fabric came back together under her fingers. It was a small act, a tiny repair in a world that felt broken beyond fixing, but it was something. It was an anchor. She was aware of him watching her. She did not look up, but she could feel his gaze from across the room. He had stopped cleaning the rifle. The rhythmic sound of the oilcloth on steel had ceased. He was just watching her, and the quality of his stillness had changed. There was a curiosity in it now, a quiet contemplation. She kept her eyes on her work, a faint warmth rising in her cheeks. When she was finished, the seam was a tidy, raised line, strong and secure. She folded the shirt and placed it on the foot of his bed. He never mentioned it, but when he went out later, he was wearing it. The day passed in this way, a series of shared tasks and quiet movements. They moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken understanding, an instinctive choreography. It was as if they had been living this way for 20 years, their habits and routines worn into a comfortable pattern. when in fact they had not yet lived this way for a single full day. The dread of the morning, the expectation of the men's return, slowly faded with the passing hours. The sun rose high in the sky, warm and bright, and the world seemed too peaceful to hold such violence. But neither of them truly relaxed. The rifle was never far from his hand. The door remained bolted. In the afternoon, he went outside to work. She watched him from the open doorway, the sunlight a warm bar across the floor. He was driving posts for a corral, a new one by the look of it. He would set a thick pine post in the hole he'd dug, and then he would swing a massive sledgehammer, its head a great block of iron, to drive it deep into the hard, red earth. He had taken off his newly mended shirt, and his back, broad and corded with muscle, gleamed with a thin sheen of sweat in the afternoon sun. The work was rhythmic, powerful. The hammer would rise high in the air, seeming to hang there for a beat against the blue sky, and then fall with a deafening thud that echoed in the clearing. With each blow, the post sank a little deeper, becoming a permanent part of the land. She sat on the cabin stoop, her arms wrapped around her knees, and watched him for a long time. The fear that had been her constant companion for days began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of awe. This man was rooted to this place, as strong and unyielding as the posts he was driving into the ground. He had faced down the night, and now he was calmly, methodically building his world under the bright sun, one hammer blow at a time. He wasn't just a protector. He was a builder, a settler, a man who did not run. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the plains in hues of orange and gold. His shadow stretched long and dark across the red ground. He finished driving the last post for the day and stood for a moment, leaning on the handle of the sledgehammer, breathing heavily. She stood up and walked toward him, her bare feet soft in the dust. She did not know what she was going to say until the words were already leaving her lips. She stopped a few feet away from him as he turned, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice quiet in the vast, open space. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable as always, but he did not seem surprised by the question. He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to decide if a name was a thing he was willing to share. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the evening breeze. "Luke," he said finally. The name was like him, short, strong, simple. It fit. He held her gaze, and then he did something that surprised her. He asked a question of his own, the first he had ever asked her. "And you?" The question was a small, quiet thing, but it landed on her with the force of a physical blow. Who was she? The girl who had run, the girl who had hidden, the girl who had brought trouble to this man's door. The name her parents had given her felt like a costume she had shed somewhere back in the dark. It didn't feel real anymore, but she had to give him something. "June," she said, the name a strange, unfamiliar sound on her own tongue. She looked away from his intense gaze, down at the red earth at her feet. She added, so softly he might have been the only one to hear, "I think." The name, once spoken aloud, hung in the air between them. June. It felt both fragile and strangely defiant. To claim a name, even one she wasn't sure of, was to claim an existence. Luke had accepted it with a slow nod, the setting sun glinting in his dark, unreadable eyes. And with that single exchange, a subtle but profound shift occurred. They were no longer just the man and the girl. They were Luke and June. Days bled into one another, falling into a rhythm as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. The promised return of Jedediah and his men became a ghost, a menacing shadow that faded with each peaceful sunrise. The fear did not vanish entirely. It had burrowed too deep inside her for that. But it retreated, becoming a dull, persistent ache rather than a sharp, stabbing pain. It was a constant reminder of the world beyond the small clearing. But the clearing itself had become a sanctuary. June found her place in the quiet routine of the cabin. She learned the specific groan of the floorboard near the hearth, the way the morning light first touched the rim of the water bucket, the particular scent of the pine needles Luke used to bank the fire at night. She rose before him now, the task of coaxing the fire to life her own. She ground the coffee beans, the rough sound of the hand mill a welcome noise in the morning quiet. She learned to bake a dense, serviceable bread in the Dutch oven buried in the coals. Luke, in turn, accepted her presence as he accepted the sunrise or the changing of the wind. He never instructed her, never praised her, never corrected her, but she would see him watch her as she worked, a fleeting, contemplative look in his eyes before he turned back to his own tasks. When she took to sweeping the packed earth floor of the clearing around the cabin's stoop each morning, he said nothing. But the next day she found a proper broom with a birch handle and tightly bound straw leaning against the door, a vast improvement on the bundle of twigs she had been using. It was his way. He spoke in actions, not words. Her body began to heal. The cuts on her feet, tended with a salve of boiled yarrow she found growing near the stream, hardened into pale scars. The scratch on her face faded. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, and the wild, hunted look in her eyes was gradually replaced by a watchful calm. She was still a bird with a broken wing, but here, in the shelter of this silent man's world, she was slowly, carefully beginning to mend. It was on one of these quiet, sun-drenched afternoons, perhaps a week after she had first stumbled into the clearing, that she discovered it. Luke was out, checking a line of snares he had set in the low hills to the west. He often left for hours at a time now, leaving her with the bolted door and the rifle propped near the hearth. A silent transfer of trust that was more meaningful than any spoken promise. The cabin, scrubbed and swept, felt empty without his large presence filling it. To stave off the creeping loneliness, she decided to undertake a thorough cleaning, a battle against the fine red dust that was a constant, tireless invader. She was wiping down the walls, the rough logs coarse under the damp rag, when she turned her attention to the small, sturdy chest that sat against the far wall, under the hide-covered window. It was the only piece of furniture in the cabin besides the bed and the table that showed any sign of real craftsmanship. It was not cobbled together from rough planks like the table, but built of smooth, dark cherry wood, its corners joined with intricate dovetail joints. The wood was old, glowing with a deep, rich patina that only comes from years of being touched and tended. It was beautiful, an object of quiet elegance in the starkly functional room. It felt out of place, a relic from another life. She ran her rag over the smooth, cool surface of the lid. She had dusted it before, of course, but had never paid it much mind. Today, however, she noticed something new. In the top drawer, set flush with the wood, was a small, ornate brass lock, tarnished with age. A keyhole, a tiny black teardrop, stared up at her. She stopped, her hand hovering over it. A locked drawer. In this entire cabin, where every tool, every blanket, every tin of beans was out in the open, a thing of clear and simple purpose. Here was a secret, a place of deliberate concealment. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't had the luxury of experiencing in a long time, stirred within her. What did a man like Luke, a man who lived his life with such stark, brutal honesty, feel the need to lock away? Her fingers, acting of their own accord, reached out and traced the outline of the brass plate. The metal was cool against her skin. She touched the keyhole, her index finger lightly brushing its edges. It was a small, intimate gesture, an unthinking act of inquiry. She was not trying to open it. She was simply touching the mystery, acknowledging its presence. Now's not the time. The voice came from directly behind her. It was low, quiet, and utterly devoid of inflection, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. She gasped, snatching her hand back as if the lock had burned her. She hadn't heard him enter. He moved with the silence of a shadow, a hunter's grace that she was still not accustomed to. She turned around slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stood in the middle of the room, holding a brace of rabbits in one hand. He was not angry. There was no fire in his eyes, no tightening of his jaw. But the stillness was back. The profound, unnerving emptiness she had seen on the first night. His gaze was not on her, but on the chest, on the locked drawer her fingers had just touched. And in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before. A deep, ancient pain, a shadow of a wound that had never healed. He wasn't angry at her. He was guarding the drawer, guarding the memory it contained. From the world, from himself, and now, from her. She felt a flush of shame creep up her neck. I was just cleaning, she stammered, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes finally shifting to meet hers. The pain was gone, locked away as securely as the contents of the drawer, but the emptiness remained. "I know," he said, and that was all. He walked past her to the table and set the rabbits down, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as ever. The moment was over. A boundary had been drawn, and she had been gently but firmly pushed back. The comfortable, easy silence they had built over the past week was gone. In its place was a new, strained quiet, filled with the unspoken thing that lay locked in the cherry-wood chest. June moved about the cabin for the rest of the afternoon, her movements stiff and uncertain. She felt like an intruder again. She had touched something private, and in doing so, had reminded them both that she was a stranger here, an outsider who knew nothing of the man who was keeping her alive. Luke seemed unaffected, but she knew it was a performance. He skinned the rabbits with his usual efficiency, his hands steady, but he did not whistle the low, tuneless melody he sometimes did when he worked. He did not look at her. He had retreated back into the fortress of his silence, and she did not know how to draw him out. That night, the tension was a thick, suffocating blanket. They ate their dinner of rabbit stew without a word. She was acutely aware of every small sound, the scrape of her spoon against the tin bowl, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside. She felt his gaze on her from time to time, but when she looked up, he was always staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. When it was time to sleep, she lay down on her blanket, her back to him, and feigned a restfulness she did not feel. The image of the locked drawer was burned into her mind. It represented his past, a past he kept under lock and key, a past that still had the power to wound him. She had seen him face down armed men without a flicker of fear, had watched him tame the wilderness with his bare hands. He was a pillar of strength, a man who seemed utterly self-sufficient, a man who needed nothing and no one. She lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the quiet sounds of the night. The fire settled into embers. The cabin grew darker. She heard the soft rustle of the buffalo hide as he shifted in his bed. The cabin was utterly still. And then she heard it. It was a sound so soft, so quiet. She almost thought she had imagined it. It was the barest exhalation of air, a sound of profound and weary sadness. A sigh. It was not a sound of frustration or annoyance. It was the sound of a weight, a burden that was carried day after day, year after year, in the silent solitude of a man's own heart. It was a sound that was never meant to be heard by another living soul. It was a crack in the granite, a glimpse into the deep, hidden well of his sorrow. In that single, unguarded moment, Luke ceased to be the unshakable protector, the silent monolith of strength. He became something else entirely. He became human. He was a man who had been hurt, a man who carried a grief so heavy that it escaped him in his sleep, in the dark, when he thought no one was listening. A wave of emotion washed over her, something fierce and protective and achingly sad. Her own fears, her own flight, seemed to suddenly shrink in comparison to the ancient, settled grief contained in that one, quiet sound. He had saved her from the monsters in the dark, but he had not been able to save himself from the ghosts within. She lay perfectly still, her eyes open in the darkness, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel like the one who needed protection. She looked toward the dark shape of his bed, and for the first time, she saw the invincible man as what he truly was: vulnerable. His sigh in the dark had changed things. It was a sound that could not be unheard, a truth that could not be unlearned. The wall of silent, unshakable strength he had built around himself had been revealed to have a crack in it, and through that crack, she had glimpsed a landscape of sorrow that was as vast and lonely as the plains outside. The next day, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. The easy, comfortable silence they had cultivated was gone, replaced by a careful, fragile quiet. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a new uncertainty. June found herself watching him, not as a protector or a savior, but as a man. She noticed the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across his forehead when he was concentrating, the network of fine white lines that fanned from the corners of his eyes when he squinted into the sun, the way his large, calloused hands could be impossibly gentle as he carved a piece of wood. He, in turn, seemed more aware of her. His gaze would linger on her for a beat longer than necessary as she kneaded bread or tended the fire. It was not a look of suspicion or desire, but of a deep, searching curiosity, as if he were seeing her for the first time not as a refugee, a piece of trouble that had washed up on his shore, but as June, a woman. The sky that afternoon began to reflect their shared unease. The brilliant, cloudless blue that had stretched over them for days began to curdle, darkening at the edges. By late afternoon, a heavy, bruised purple blanket had been drawn across the horizon, and the air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, electric tension. The world seemed to be holding its breath. As evening fell, the wind began to rise. It started as a low, mournful sigh through the eaves of the cabin, a lonely sound that made the small flame of the oil lamp flicker and dance. They ate their dinner in near silence, the usual quiet now punctuated by the growing voice of the wind as it howled and moaned, probing at the log walls like a restless spirit. June cleared the plates from the table, her movements economical, her senses on high alert. Every gust of wind that slammed against the cabin made her flinch. The memory of the men outside, of their harsh voices and the rattle of the door latch, was a ghost that had been resurrected by the storm. She glanced at Luke. He sat by the hearth, sharpening his skinning knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone a steady, calming sound against the chaos outside. He seemed unbothered by the storm, as much a part of the wild landscape as the wind itself, but she noticed his shoulders were set, and his gaze, though fixed on his work, seemed distant. He was listening, too. She finished wiping down the table and turned to put the rag away. At that exact moment, a ferocious blast of wind hit the cabin with the force of a physical blow. The entire structure groaned, and the leather hide over the window flapped violently. The flame in the lamp leaped high, sputtered, and then, with a soft pop, was extinguished. The darkness that fell was absolute. It was a disorienting, velvety black, broken only by the faint, pulsing red glow of the embers in the hearth. The sudden absence of light was a shock, stripping away the familiar comfort of the small room and leaving them adrift in a sea of shadows and sound. And the sounds were terrifying. The wind shrieked, no longer a mournful sigh, but an angry, predatory scream. In the midst of its howling, another sound, sharper and closer, made her heart leap into her throat, a metallic rattle. It was the door latch, shaking in its housing as the heavy wooden door vibrated under the onslaught of the wind. It was just the wind. She knew it was just the wind. But in the dark, in the chaos of the storm, the sound was indistinguishable from the memory of Jedediah's hand trying the door. The past and the present collapsed into a single, terrifying moment. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her hand outstretched, her breath caught in her chest. She could not see Luke, but she could feel his presence across the room, a center of gravity in the swirling dark. He had not moved. He was a pool of stillness in the heart of the storm. "Luke," she whispered, her voice a thin thread, nearly lost in the roar of the wind. "The door, did you lock it?" The rhythmic scraping of the knife had stopped. The silence from his side of the room was as profound as the darkness. For a long moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, his voice came out of the gloom, low and calm, yet carrying a strange new timbre, a hint of something she had never heard before. "Do you want me to lock it?" The question threw her off balance. It was not the simple, practical answer she had expected. It was something else entirely. He wasn't asking for information. He was asking about her will, her desire. He was turning the act of locking the door from a simple chore into a choice. Her choice. She could see his shape now, a dark silhouette against the faint red glow of the embers. He had turned in his chair to face her. She couldn't see his expression, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. The space between them crackled with the same electric tension as the air outside. This was no longer about the storm. It was about them. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. The rattling of the latch came again, a sharp, insistent sound that frayed her already raw nerves. "Lock it," she breathed, the words a soft command born of her returning fear. He did not move. His silhouette remained perfectly still. He was waiting. "Say please," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the words landed with an astonishing force. It was not a command. It was a challenge, a test. In the entire time she had been here, she had been the recipient of his silent protection. He had offered it without being asked, had stood between her and the dark simply because she was there. Now, for the first time, he was asking her to ask. He was asking her to acknowledge her need for him, to voice it, to make it real between them. It was a subtle shift of power, a redrawing of the unspoken lines that defined their strange relationship. A hot flush of confusion and something else, something warm and unfamiliar, spread through her chest. Her pride, a small, stubborn thing that had survived everything else, bristled. Why should she have to ask, why was he doing this? But then she looked at his dark shape, at the utter stillness of him, and she understood. This wasn't about power. Not really. It was about honesty. He had shown her his vulnerability, that one unguarded sigh in the dark. Now he was asking for a piece of hers in return, an admission, a request. The wind howled, and the latch rattled again, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, heavy beat of her own heart. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable. The bolted door had been a symbol of his strength. Now, the act of locking it had become a symbol of her trust. She took a shaky breath. The word felt heavy in her mouth, freighted with a meaning that went far beyond simple politeness. To say it would be to admit that she was not just a survivor who had stumbled into his care, but a woman who was choosing to place her safety, her faith, in his hands. "Please," she whispered. The word was barely audible, a ghost of a sound. But in the charged silence of the cabin, it was as loud as a shout. For a moment, he still did not move. He let the word hang in the air between them, letting its weight settle. Then, he rose from his chair. He did not go to the lamp to relight it. He moved through the darkness with a familiar, easy grace, his boots making almost no sound on the wooden floor. He stopped before the door. She heard the faint, metallic scrape as he took the heavy iron key from the peg where it hung. Then, the sound of the key sliding into the lock. It was not a quick, perfunctory action. He was deliberately slow. The tumblers inside the lock gave a series of soft, precise clicks as he turned the key. Each click was a distinct, intimate sound, a small mechanical heartbeat in the belly of the storm. The final thud as the bolt slid home was a sound of profound finality. It echoed in the small room, a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in the marrow of her bones. The door was locked. The storm was shut out. But they were shut in. Together. The act was complete. It was more than a simple securing of a door. It was a promise, spoken and answered in the dark. It was a new contract, sealed not with a signature, but with a single word and the slow, deliberate turning of a key. And as June stood there in the shadows, listening to the fury of the wind that could no longer touch her, she felt the last of her fear finally, truly, begin to recede. It was replaced by something new, something warm and terrifying and utterly unknown. The new intimacy born in the storm's darkness was a fragile, tender thing, a seedling pushing its way through hard ground. The days that followed were quiet, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer a space of caution or comfort, but a field of unspoken potential, charged with the memory of her whispered pleas and the solid, final thud of the lock. They spoke little, but their glances held entire conversations. A shared look across the breakfast table, a moment when his hand brushed hers as she passed him a tool. Each was a small spark in the growing warmth between them. The peace lasted for 3 more days. On the 4th night, it was shattered. There was no storm this time to mask their approach. The night was still, clear, and cold. The sky a vast spill of diamond dust stars. June was banking the fire for the night, the familiar, rhythmic task a comfort, when Luke suddenly went rigid. He was standing by the door, about to slide the heavy bar across for the night, and he froze, his head cocked, listening to a sound she could not hear. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum of dread. He didn't answer. He held up a hand for silence, his eyes fixed on the door as if he could see through the thick wood. Then she heard it. Not the sound of horses, not the crunch of boots. It was a faint, stealthy rustling from multiple directions at once, the sound of men trying and failing to move like ghosts through the dry grass. "Get back," he said, his voice a low growl. He slid the heavy bar into its brackets with a solid thump, then turned and grabbed the rifle from its pegs above the mantel. He had just turned from the wall when the first torch was thrown. It was not aimed at the door, but at the roof. It arced through the night, a beautiful, terrible comet of orange and red, and landed on the dry shake shingles with a soft whoosh. A second later, another torch landed on the other side. An orange glow, brighter and more menacing than any firelight, began to seep through the cracks in the ceiling. The smell of burning pine, sharp and acrid, filled the cabin. "Jedediah!" Luke bit out, the name a curse. He had known this was coming. He had been waiting. Panic, cold and absolute, seized June. They were trapped. They were going to burn alive. The men outside started shouting, their voices triumphant and ugly. "Come on out, friend, or we'll cook you in your own house. Send out the girl, and we might just let you live." Luke ignored them. He moved with a swift, brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. He kicked the braided rug away from a section of the floor near the hearth, revealing a thick, square plank with a small, inset iron ring. He pulled it, and a section of the floor lifted away, revealing a dark, yawning hole, a root cellar. "Get in," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her toward the opening. "There's a tunnel. It comes out by the stream. Go, now." She looked from his face, grim and set in the flickering, hellish light, down into the absolute black of the hole. He was trying to save her. He was preparing to face them alone, to die in this fire so that she could escape. And something inside her broke, not with fear, but with a sudden, blazing fury. The girl who had stumbled here, bruised and terrified, was gone. The woman who had mended his shirt, who had learned the rhythms of his silence, who had asked him to lock the door, was here instead. And she would not run. She would not leave him. She pulled her arm from his grasp. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the roar of the growing fire and the taunts of the men outside. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief in the orange glow. "June, this is no time for—" "If you fight," she said, stepping back from the cellar, her gaze locked with his. "I fight too." The declaration hung in the air between them, more powerful than the fire, more absolute than the threat outside. It was a vow, for a heartbeat. He looked at her, and his hard, weathered face was stripped of everything but a raw, stark astonishment. He had seen her as something to be protected. He had not seen her as a partner. There was no time to argue. The heat in the cabin was becoming intense, and the smoke was thickening, stinging their eyes. A heavy blow, the sound of a battering ram, struck the door. The wood groaned, splintering. Luke's astonishment vanished, replaced by a grim, feral light in his eyes. He gave her a single, sharp nod of acceptance. He didn't have another gun to give her, but he pointed to the fireplace. "The poker," he said. He shoved the heavy table on its side, creating a makeshift barricade a few feet from the door. Then he took his position behind it, the long rifle resting on the tabletop, aimed at the splintering wood. June scrambled to the hearth. The iron poker was resting in the embers, its tip a bright, incandescent orange. She wrapped a spare rag around her hand and grabbed it. The heat was immense, but the weight of it in her hand was solid, real. It was a weapon, her weapon. The door burst inwards with a scream of tortured wood and broken iron. 3 figures, dark silhouettes against the blazing torches and the burning roof, stormed in. They were no longer testing, no longer probing. They had come for a kill. The world dissolved into a chaos of noise and violence. The rifle in Luke's hands boomed, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. One of the silhouettes screamed and fell backward out of the doorway. Gunpowder smoke, thick and sulphurous, mixed with the wood smoke, choking the air. The other 2 men charged, firing their own pistols. The bullets tore through the cabin, splintering the log walls, sending chips of wood flying. June dropped to the floor behind the overturned bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, the hot poker clutched in her hand. Luke worked the rifle with a terrifying speed, but it was a single-shot weapon. He fired again, but the second man was already diving to the side, taking cover behind the chest of drawers. The third man, a big burly figure she recognized as Jedediah, charged straight at Luke's barricade, a long-bladed knife clutched in his hand. Luke dropped the rifle and drew a heavy pistol from his belt. He fired, but Jedediah was too close. The big man slammed into the table, sending it skidding back. The 2 men grappled, a desperate, grunting struggle of muscle and steel in the smoke and flickering light. The second man, the one behind the chest, saw his chance. He saw her. He rose from his cover, a pistol in his hand, a cruel grin on his face. He was ignoring Luke, coming for her. "There you are, pretty thing," he snarled. Terror and fury warred within her. He took a step toward her, raising his pistol. There was no time to think. She acted. She rose from behind the bed with a scream, a raw, primal sound torn from the very depths of her soul, and lunged forward. She held the poker like a spear, its glowing tip leading the way. The man's grin vanished, replaced by a look of shocked surprise. He tried to bring his pistol to bear, but she was too fast. She thrust the poker forward with all her strength. The glowing tip struck him square in the chest. There was a horrific sizzling sound, and the sickening smell of scorched cloth and flesh. He shrieked, a high, thin sound of pure agony, and staggered backward, dropping his pistol, his hands clawing at his chest. He stumbled, tripped, and fell, his body convulsing on the floor. June stood over him, panting, the poker still clutched in her hand. She had done it. She had fought back. A sharp, cracking report from the other side of the room snapped her back to the larger battle. She turned just in time to see Luke stumble. He had managed to fight Jedediah off, but a 4th man had appeared in the doorway, a pistol smoking in his hand. Luke had a dark, spreading stain on his side, He grunted in pain, his legs buckling slightly, but he did not fall. He raised his own pistol and fired, and the man in the doorway collapsed without a sound. But the fight had cost him. He was wounded. Jedediah saw it, and a savage grin split his face. He advanced on the staggering Luke, his knife held low. "You should have stayed out of it, farmer," he spat. Luke raised his pistol again, but his arm was shaking. Jedediah lunged. Luke fired, but the shot went wide. June looked down. The pistol the man she had burned had dropped lay on the floor near her feet. It was a heavy, ugly piece of metal. She had never fired a gun in her life. She didn't hesitate. She dropped the poker and scrambled for the pistol, her fingers closing around the cold, wooden grip. It felt impossibly heavy, an alien thing in her hand. She pushed herself to her feet. Jedediah had knocked Luke's pistol from his hand and was raising his knife for the final blow. "No!" June screamed. She lifted the gun with both hands, trying to control its trembling. She pointed it in Jedediah's direction. She couldn't see the sights. Her vision was a blur of smoke and tears and terror. She just pointed it at the center of his dark, menacing shape and pulled the trigger. The gun exploded in her hands, the recoil slamming her back a step. The sound was a physical blow, a clap of thunder that shook the very foundation of the cabin. Jedediah screamed, a sound of rage and pain. He did not fall, but he staggered back, clutching his leg. A dark stain was spreading down his thigh. The fight was broken. The man on the floor was still moaning. Jedediah, wounded, looked from the bleeding Luke to the wild-eyed June, who still held the smoking pistol pointed at him. He saw the fire now eating its way down the walls. He saw his other two men lying motionless outside the door. It wasn't worth it. "Get up!" he roared at the man on the floor. He limped to the doorway, dragging his wounded leg, and helped the other man to his feet. Without a backward glance, they plunged out into the night. A moment later, she heard the frantic sound of horses galloping away into the darkness, leaving behind only the roar of the fire and a sudden, deafening silence. The last echo of the gunshot faded, swallowed by the roar of the fire. In its place, a ringing silence descended, a silence filled with the rasp of Luke's breathing and the frantic, wild thumping of June's own heart. Smoke, thick and acrid, clawed at her throat. The roof, now a lattice of flame against the night sky, was beginning to collapse inwards. The sanctuary was becoming a tomb. Adrenaline, a fierce, cleansing fire, surged through her. There was no time for fear, no time for shock. She looked at Luke. He was leaning against the wall, one hand pressed tight against his side, his face pale and slick with sweat in the hellish orange light. His eyes were on her, and in them she saw not defeat, but a flicker of that same raw astonishment from before, now mingled with a grim, urgent pride. "The fire," he grunted, the words costing him. She didn't need to be told. She dropped the heavy pistol, its weight forgotten, and ran for the water bucket. It was half full. She threw the contents at the flames that were licking their way down the wall, hissing and spitting in a cloud of steam, buying them a few precious seconds. It wasn't enough. "Blankets," Luke ordered, his voice strained. "Soak them." She grabbed the wool blanket from the floor and the heavy buffalo hide from his bed, shoving them into the bucket, soaking them with the last of the water. They were impossibly heavy. She dragged the waterlogged wool to the nearest wall of fire and began beating at the flames, the wet thuds a desperate drumbeat against the roar. Luke pushed himself off the wall, a low groan of agony escaping his lips. He staggered to the other side of the cabin, using the overturned table as a support, and began tearing down the hide covering from the window, trying to create an escape route, but his movements were slow, his strength failing. After a moment, he slumped against the wall, his head bowed, his breathing ragged. June saw him falter. A new kind of terror, sharper and more personal than any she had felt for herself, seized her. She would not lose him. She would not let this place, this home he had carved from the wilderness, be consumed. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming from the smoke. She was no longer just fighting for her own life. She was fighting for his, for theirs. She beat at the flames, again and again, her arms screaming in protest, the smoke a thick, choking blanket. The fire was a living beast, snarling and retreating only to leap forward again somewhere else. Slowly, impossibly, she began to gain ground. The flames on the walls receded, leaving behind blackened, smoldering logs. The greatest danger was the roof, but with the walls contained, the immediate threat of being engulfed lessened. The fire would burn itself out, and the main structure, the solid log walls, would hold. When the last of the nearby flames was reduced to a smoking, hissing ruin, she dropped the heavy, scorched blanket and stumbled through the haze toward Luke. He had slid down the wall and was sitting on the floor, his head resting against the logs, his eyes closed. The dark stain on his side had spread, a terrible, blossoming flower on his homespun shirt. "Luke," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. His eyes fluttered open. He tried to smile, a grim twist of his lips. "You fight well, June," he rasped. Tears she hadn't known she possessed streamed down her smoke-stained cheeks, cutting clean paths through the grime. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wound, afraid to touch, afraid not to. We have to fix this." The next hours, and the days that followed, became a blur of focused, desperate care. Her entire world shrank to the confines of the smoky, damaged cabin, and then shrank further, to the man lying wounded in the bed. Getting him there had been a monumental struggle, his near-dead weight a testament to the life that was threatening to slip away from him. She cut away the blood-soaked shirt with his skinning knife, her hands surprisingly steady. The wound was a raw, angry tear in the flesh of his side, just below the ribs. It was deep, and it was bleeding with a slow, steady persistence that terrified her. She knew, with the cold, hard certainty of frontier life, that the bullet was still inside, and she knew that if it didn't come out, a fever would take him where Jedediah's knife could not. She worked like a field surgeon, her fear and revulsion locked away in a deep, cold place. She heated water over the smoldering embers of the fire, the cabin now eerily open to the night sky through the charred hole in its roof. She tore strips from the hem of her own tattered dress, the last remnant of her old life, sacrificing it to save her new one. Cleaning the wound was an agony for both of them. He never cried out, but his body went rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the bed, a low, guttural sound of pure pain rumbling in his chest. She whispered to him as she worked, a constant stream of soft, meaningless words. "It's all right. I'm here. Just hold on. I'm here." The bullet was lodged deep. Probing for it with the heated tip of the knife was the worst part. He lost consciousness for a moment, his body going limp, and she thought she had lost him, but his pulse, a faint, thready flutter at his throat, was still there. With tears blurring her vision, she found it, a small, hard lump of lead against the hard curve of a rib. Getting it out was a clumsy, bloody business, but she did it. She bandaged him tightly with the clean strips of cloth, her hands shaking now that the worst was over. Or so she thought. The fever came that night. It came upon him like a thief, stealing his strength and his reason. He tossed and turned, his skin burning to the touch, his body racked with shivers. He began to murmur, his voice rough and broken, his words a fevered jumble of past and present. He spoke of snow, of a river choked with ice, of a woman's name, Anna, repeated over and over like a prayer. He cried out orders to men she didn't know, his hands clenching and unclenching on the buffalo hide. June's vigil began. She did not sleep for 3 days. She sat in the chair by his bed, a silent guardian in the half-ruined cabin. She bathed his face and chest with cool water from the stream, trying to quell the fire that was consuming him from within. She forced sips of water between his cracked lips. She held his hand when he thrashed, her small grip a desperate anchor in his storm-tossed sea of delirium. In those long, terrible hours, she learned the landscape of his pain. The locked drawer was no longer a mystery. It was a tomb, and Anna was its ghost. The emptiness he carried, the profound solitude, it was not a choice, but a consequence. She was watching a man haunted, a man who had walled himself off from the world to keep his ghosts inside. On the third night, the fever broke. She felt the change before she saw it. The burning heat of his skin began to recede, replaced by a sheen of cleansing sweat. His thrashing subsided. His breathing deepened, becoming slow and regular. For the first time, he slept a true, healing sleep. June, utterly spent, laid her head on the edge of his bed, her hand still holding his, and finally let sleep take her too. She awoke to the feeling of being watched. She lifted her head, her neck stiff, and found him awake. He was weak, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes were clear. The ghosts were gone. He was looking at her, his gaze free of its usual shadows, filled with a quiet, raw clarity. She realized she was still holding his hand. She started to pull away, her cheeks flushing, but his fingers tightened around hers, a weak but deliberate pressure. He would not let her go. She settled back in the chair, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. They stayed like that for a long time, in the quiet of the morning, the sunlight streaming through the hole in the roof, dust motes dancing in the golden bars of light. The silence was not empty. It was full of everything that had passed between them, the fear, the violence, the pain, the shared fight for survival. His throat worked, and he licked his dry lips. His voice, when it came, was a barely audible rasp, a sound of immense effort. "Since I met you," he whispered, his eyes locked on hers, "I don't feel empty anymore." The words were a key, turning the lock not on the cherry wood chest, but on his own heart. He was giving her the truth she had only glimpsed in his fever dreams. It was the most profound confession, the most vulnerable admission he could possibly make. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. They were tears of exhaustion, of relief, but mostly they were tears of a deep, resonant joy that was so intense it was painful. She had been empty to a hollowed-out thing, running from a life that had no meaning, toward a future that had no hope. He had filled her world, given her a purpose. He had given her a home. She leaned closer, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "Me neither," she choked out. The days that followed were a slow, quiet return to life. Luke's recovery was arduous, his strength returning in frustratingly small increments. But he was alive, and he was hers to care for. The dynamic between them had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer the refugee, and he was no longer the unassailable protector. They were simply Luke and June. They did not need many words. Their new language was one of quiet rituals. She would bring him a bowl of thin broth, and he would watch her every movement as she crossed the room. She would sit by his bed in the long afternoons, mending the damage to the cabin's few belongings, and he would follow the line of her needle with his eyes. She would read to him sometimes, from a small, worn Bible she had found in the chest, the one drawer that wasn't locked, her voice soft and steady in the quiet of the cabin. He watched her constantly. His gaze was a physical touch, a silent conversation. It held gratitude. It held a deep, wondering tenderness, and it held the clear, simple truth of the promise that had taken root between them in the heart of the fire. It was a promise of healing, a promise of companionship, a promise that neither of them would ever have to be empty again. In the silence, between the breaths of a life they had almost lost, their love, quiet and profound, was beginning to grow. The seasons began to turn. The high, sharp winds of autumn gave way to the crisp, clean cold of early winter. Luke's strength returned. A slow but steady tide, the wound in his side healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar that was a permanent reminder of the night the cabin burned, the night they had fought together. They rebuilt the roof, a slow, arduous task that became a partnership. He, still unable to do heavy lifting, would show her which logs to select, how to notch them with the axe. She, in turn, became his hands, her movements growing sure and strong, her body lean and capable. They worked in the cold, clear air, their breaths pluming in front of them, their shared silence a comfortable, well-worn blanket. The space between them, once a chasm of uncertainty, then a field of tension, had become a bridge. The love that had taken root in the ashes of the fire grew quietly, a hardy, resilient thing. It lived not in grand declarations, but in small, ordinary moments, in the way he would place a hot cup of coffee by her hand in the morning without a word, in the way she would save him the best piece of smoked rabbit, in the way their eyes would meet across the room in a look of such complete and effortless understanding that words were unnecessary. His past remained a locked room. He never spoke the name Anna again, and the cherry wood chest sat against the wall, a silent, beautiful monument to a grief she had only glimpsed. She never went near it, never touched it. She understood that it was his to open, in his own time. She had made her promise, I'm not going anywhere, and she would keep it. She would wait. Then, one morning, the time came. It was a day of brilliant, blinding winter sun. A fresh layer of snow had fallen in the night, and the world outside the cabin was a pristine expanse of white, the air so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. Luke was preparing to go out, checking his trap lines. He was bundled in a heavy sheepskin coat, his rifle in hand. June was by the hearth, kneading a lump of dough for their daily bread, her hands dusted with flour. He stopped at the door, then turned. He walked back to the table and placed something on the rough, wooden surface. It was a small, ornate brass key. It lay in the center of the table, gleaming in a stray bar of sunlight, a silent, deliberate offering. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes stripped of all their usual guards. It was a look of profound, terrifying trust. He was giving her the key not just to a drawer, but to the most wounded part of himself. He was inviting her in. Then he turned and left, the cabin door closing softly behind him, leaving her alone with the key and the choice. Her hands, covered in flour, began to tremble. Her heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She looked from the key to the cherry wood chest. For a long time, she did not move. This was not a test of her curiosity, but of her heart. To open it would be to accept the full weight of his past, to embrace the ghost that lived between them. To leave it locked would be to respect his pain, but to leave a wall standing between them forever. She knew what she had to do. She washed the flour from her hands, drying them carefully on her apron. Her movements were slow, reverent, as if she were in a church. She walked to the table and picked up the key. It was cool and surprisingly heavy in her palm. She knelt before the chest. Her hand was steady as she slid the key into the small, dark keyhole. It turned with a soft, well-oiled click, a sound of quiet surrender. She took a deep breath and gently pulled the drawer open. The air that rose from it was a ghost of a scent, the faint, sweet smell of dried lavender and old paper. The contents were few, laid out with a kind of neat, heartbreaking precision. There was a letter, a single sheet of paper folded in half, its edges softened with time. The handwriting on the front was bold and clear. To Anna. June's breath caught in her throat. She unfolded it. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. My dearest Anna. It began. She did not read further. It was not her letter to read, but her eyes fell to the bottom of the page, to the strong, familiar signature, forever yours, Luke, and beside the signature, a date from 5 years prior. The letter was unsent. a message of love that had never reached its destination. Beside the letter lay a woman's ring. It was a simple, slender band of gold, not ornate, but worn smooth, as if it had been held and turned in a man's hand 1,000 times. It was a ring of promise, a symbol of a future that had been stolen. And beneath the ring, there was a small, torn scrap of paper, on it, in the same strong hand as the letter, but this time with a hurried, jagged edge to the script, were 4 short, brutal words. She didn't wait for me. June stared at the words, and the last pieces of the puzzle that was Luke fell into place. The emptiness, the self-imposed exile, the silence. It was not the grief of a man whose love had died. It was the grief of a man whose love had abandoned him. He had been coming back to her, letter and ring in hand, full of promises, only to find an empty space where his future was supposed to be. There was no anger in the drawer. There was no bitterness. There was only a profound, bottomless sorrow. A life, a love, a future all left unfinished. It was a story without an ending. A wound that had been left open to fester in the lonely silence of the wilderness. June felt a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She felt no jealousy, no insecurity in the face of this old love. Anna was not her rival. She was a ghost, and June's heart ached for the man who had been forced to live with her for so long. He had not been hiding his past from her. He had been protecting her from its sadness, and now he had trusted her to look into its depths and not turn away. She gently folded the letter and placed it back. She set the ring beside it. She looked at the small, heartbreaking note. Her promise to him, "I'm not going anywhere," had been an instinct, a feeling. Now, it was a conscious, deliberate choice. She was the answer to this note. She was the one who would wait. She was the one who would stay. She stood up and went to the cabin door. Outside, peeking through the snow near the stoop, was a single, stubborn winter wildflower, a tiny, resilient splash of purple against the stark white. She carefully plucked it and brought it inside. She knelt again before the open drawer. She took the small flower and laid it gently inside. Next to the ring and the letter, it was a splash of color, a piece of the living, breathing present, laid to rest amongst the ghosts of the past. It was not an erasure. It was an addition, a promise of new growth. Then she closed the drawer, the sound a soft, respectful click. She turned the key, locking the memories safely back inside. But they were different now. They were no longer just his. They had been shared. She left the key on top of the chest, where he would see it, and went back to her bread. Luke returned as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of pink and rose. He carried 2 rabbits for their dinner. He entered the cabin, stamping the snow from his boots, his cheeks flushed with the cold. He glanced at the cherry wood chest. He saw the key, resting on the polished surface. Then he looked at her. His eyes held the question. She met his gaze without flinching. The air was still, charged with a silent, momentous weight. She crossed the room and stood before him, so close she could feel the cold radiating from his coat. She looked up into his face, into the eyes of the man who had shown her his deepest wound. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice quiet but firm, an unbreakable vow. A lifetime of pain seemed to melt from his eyes, replaced by a look of raw, profound relief. A slow, gentle smile, the first true smile she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently brush a stray dusting of flour from her cheek. "This time," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "I'll keep my promise." The key, left on the polished surface of the cherry wood chest, became a silent monument to their new beginning. Luke never locked the drawer again, and in time, the key found its way into a small clay pot on the mantelpiece, amongst dried flowers and interesting stones, a relic of a past that had been honored and then, finally, laid to rest. The ghosts did not vanish, but they grew quiet, their sorrowful whispers replaced by the steady, living sound of a life being built, day by day, piece by piece. Winter thawed into a wet, muddy spring. The snow retreated, leaving the earth smelling rich and fertile, pregnant with the promise of new life. Together, they repaired the last of the fire damage, replacing the scorched logs with fresh, sweet-smelling pine. The roof, once a gaping wound open to the sky, was now a solid, tightly woven shield of new shakes, a testament to their shared labor. The cabin was no longer just his shelter, or her sanctuary. It was their home, its scars a part of its story, a map of their survival. Their love was a quiet, deep-rooted thing. It lived in the rhythm of their shared days. It was in the way she would look up from her work and find him watching her, a soft, wondering light in his dark eyes. It was in the way his large hand would find hers as they walked back from the stream, his fingers lacing through hers with a natural, unquestioning ease. He began to talk more, not in long speeches, but in small observations about the world, the way a hawk circled on an updraft, the best place to find wild onions, a story from his youth about a stubborn mule. Each shared thought was a gift, a small piece of himself that he had kept locked away for years. They planted a garden in the clearing, turning the hard, red earth together. He would break the ground with a heavy mattock, his muscles moving with their old, familiar power, and she would follow behind, crumbling the soil between her fingers, planting the precious seeds she had saved from her own meal squash, beans, and corn. They worked side by side under the vast, open sky, two small figures in an immense landscape, creating a small patch of order and life in the heart of the wilderness. As the land healed from winter, so too did June's connection to the world beyond the clearing. One day, Luke brought a horse to the cabin, a gentle, sway-backed mare he had traded for with a passing trapper. "For you," he said, simply. A week later, he gave her a small deerskin pouch with a few coins in it. "There's a trading post, a day's ride east. We need salt and flour." The thought of leaving the sanctuary, of riding out into the world where men like Jedediah still roamed, sent a flicker of old fear through her. She looked at him, and he seemed to understand. He didn't push, didn't command. He just stood there, his trust in her a palpable thing. He was not sending her away. He was giving her a tether to the world, and the freedom to use it. The first time she rode out, she felt like a ghost, a girl who didn't belong in the world of people. The trading post was a noisy, chaotic place, full of rough men and tired women. But she held her head high. She bartered for the salt and flour, her voice steady. And then, with the few pennies left over, she bought something for them. A small bag of rock candy, a bolt of blue calico cloth dotted with tiny yellow flowers that reminded her of the dress she had worn on the night she arrived, and a single, shining tin whistle. When she rode back into the clearing at dusk and saw the welcoming curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a feeling of profound, homecoming joy washed over her. Luke met her at the edge of the trees, his face unreadable, but she saw the relief in his eyes. That night, after dinner, she gave him the whistle. He looked at it, then at her, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his face. He put it to his lips and played a low, simple tune, a sweet, clear melody that filled the cabin and seemed to heal the very air. Time passed, 1 year, then 2. The seasons turned, each one leaving them more deeply rooted in this place, and in each other. Their life was hard, but it was good. It was real. The corral was finished and held 2 horses now. The garden was larger, and a small flock of chickens scratched in the dust near the stoop. And then came Tom. He was born in the deep cold of their 3rd winter together, in the heart of the cabin that had become their world. He was a small, perfect miracle of dark hair and loud lungs, with his father's serious eyes and his mother's quiet smile. The cabin, once a bastion of silence, was now filled with the small, miraculous sounds of a baby's life. Luke, the silent, solitary man, was utterly transformed. He would hold his son for hours, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle, his rough voice soft as he murmured nonsense to the tiny, bundled form. June would watch them, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. The hollow, empty places inside her, the ones she had carried for so long, were filled to overflowing. The years that followed were the best of her life. Tom grew from a baby into a sturdy, curious boy. He was a child of the wilderness, at home under the vast sky. Luke taught him how to track a deer, how to read the clouds, how to carve a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. June taught him his letters, drawing them in the dirt with a stick, and sang him the lullabies her own mother had sung to her. Their life was a tapestry woven of small, beautiful moments. An afternoon spent fishing at the stream, Tom's excited shouts echoing in the quiet air. A winter evening spent huddled by the fire, Luke's low voice telling a story while June mended a tear in Tom's small trousers. A warm summer day, the three of them lying in the shade of a great, ancient oak tree at the edge of the clearing, watching the clouds drift by. It was on one such afternoon, watching Luke lift a laughing Tom high into the air, his son's small hands tangled in his dark hair, that June felt a sense of peace so complete, so absolute, that it brought tears to her eyes. The terrified girl who had run through the dark was a distant memory, a character in a story that had happened to someone else. This was her life. This was her home. One evening, after a long, satisfying day of harvesting the last of their corn, they sat on the stoop, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. Tom, exhausted from his day of helping, was already fast asleep inside, tucked into the small trundle bed Luke had built for him. A cool breeze whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The world was quiet, peaceful, safe. June leaned her head against Luke's shoulder, his arm coming around her in a familiar, comforting gesture. They sat in silence, watching the first stars begin to prick the deep, velvet sky. After a while, she rose and went to the door, her hand resting on the smooth, worn wood. It was a habit, a ritual from a lifetime ago. She looked back at him, a small, nostalgic smile playing on her lips. "Should I lock the door?" she asked, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. Luke looked at her, his face full of a deep, quiet love that still, after all these years, made her breath catch in her throat. He stood up and walked to her, his tall frame filling the doorway. He didn't answer her question with words. Instead, he reached out and gently pulled her into his arms, his embrace a circle of warmth and strength against the cooling night. He held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Not anymore," he murmured into her hair. He drew her back a step, inside the cabin, and with one hand, he gently pushed the door. It swung shut with a soft, final click, closing out the night. It wasn't bolted, it wasn't locked, but this time, it was because no one inside ever wanted to leave. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, for more stories like this one. Don't forget to like the video and hit that hype button to help share this story with more listeners.